that was sort of phenomenal, listening to the six of you, but also imagining that, of course, it's not just the six of you. It's another, roughly 200 faculty members, and who are so extraordinary. One of the things I always say about Colby, and it turns out it's actually true, there are other things I use that are maybe a little hyperbole, but this one is true, is that, our faculty could literally be anywhere, and they choose to be here. And we're so fortunate for that. And I think you saw it today in terms of the way that our faculty talked about their engagement with students and their engagement with the world. One of the things that really hit me right off the bat was this kind of sense of that deep engagement with the world. It's easy to think about a liberal arts college as this isolated place, right? You're sitting here in Waterville, Maine, and when you listen to the way that the faculty describe their work and the global and the local impact of the work, you realize there is nothing isolated or isolating about this place. It is a place that is deeply connected in the world, and that's done through the work of the faculty and the students, and it's one of the things that we can be so proud about, and I think we don't talk enough about. So there were some great quotes today, and there were a couple that stood out for me. One of them, and this is in all due deference to my friends from Chicago, because I never heard this term in the last 8 years, but the conversation about humility that we had. So Lydia, you talked about this and talked about humility and learning, but talking about humility as an approach to scholarship, that is such an important lesson for our students to think about. It's one of the things we've been talking a lot about at the beginning of this year, is the need to really question your assumptions, to question your beliefs, to be open to a different set of beliefs, and I think that's such an important part of being at Colby, and it really stood out for me in terms of the way that you described your work and the way that you approach it. Another one that you mentioned, John, was about the pushing boundaries of knowledge to answer important questions. Again, I want to just stress this because I think there's this kind of image of the liberal arts college where it's a wonderful teaching college. Turns out that's true. But it's also much more than that. It's a place where you have absolutely world-class scholars who think about scholarship in relationship to their teaching. And that's one of the things I want to ask our group about today as we start getting this going. And just as a little bit of a warning, I'm going to ask a question or two, and we're going to have a little conversation up here, but we're going to pretty quickly turn it out to all of you because I know you didn't get all of your questions answered. And as you heard, most of your questions were really focused on one issue or the other. And if you're like me, if you heard all 6 of these presentations, you saw some really interesting themes emerge and other things that raise questions. So those were some of the things that really hit me. I wanted to mention something about the local and global piece of the work that really struck me. And it was just one after another. I kept listening for this, and I was thinking about, so your work in Somalia, and then your work with Somali immigrants in Lewiston. So using Maine, this was one of the things that kept coming up too. Thinking about Maine, the natural resources of Maine, the lakes, the oceans, thinking about these crabs that are destroying our coastlines. I didn't know that until today. I didn't know I shouldn't have that Bob Marley drink either until today. But how those actually, thinking about the nature of this as a place that really is an extraordinary place for research, but it's really the beginning in some ways. It leads into other parts of the world as well. Talking about the tigers in South China, Philip, that you were talking about, in the extraordinary work that's done there, but as well the captivity of tigers throughout the U.S. So this was one theme after another. We were talking about the Belgrade Lakes. You were showing those extraordinary images from being in the oceans in the southern hemisphere. So this is again the sort of sense of Colby very much in the world as a place that has an impact on the world. And those just kept coming through for me. Another theme that kept coming up for me was the issue of partnerships and collaborations. And so I'm going to want to ask you about that. We were talking about collaborations with Bigelow Lab. We were talking about collaborations up at Mount Desert Island Laboratory. But there was one after the other in thinking about the collaborations. We were hearing about students, 50, 60, working on various research projects. That's another piece that I think is such an important part of the Colby experience and one that we should be growing over the years. Another piece that I thought was so strong was the interdisciplinary nature of your work and how that came out in one way or another. I was listening to you talking about the Middle East, and it was much a lesson in government and political science, as it was in policy, as it was in history. The way all of those things came together, I thought, were really powerful in the end. But this issue of policy, I wanted to just draw out a little bit as well. This was a bit of a surprise to me in listening to all of you. So particularly maybe for you, Lydia, in talking about, as a Hegel scholar, suddenly you're talking about policy issues related to Native American tribes in Maine and how that plays out. And actually policy issues came up one time after another, and it was an interesting theme. So again, in thinking about the liberal arts and thinking about these core disciplines and the way that you all do your work, and thinking about how it actually connects to the broader world. So I'm going to just, by way of very quick introduction, many of you were here for this, so I'm not going to say any bios or anything like this. I'm just going to give a quick name and department, and so then I'm going to ask a quick question so we can begin this conversation, if that sounds all right. So I'll go in the order that you all spoke today. Catherine Besterman, who's the Francis Bartlett and Ruth K. Bartlett Professor of Anthropology, who went first today. Whitney King on my immediate left, who's the Frank and Theodora Miselis Professor of Chemistry. Lydia Moland, Associate Professor of Philosophy. Philip Nyhus, Associate Professor of Environmental Studies. Andrea Tilden, J. Warren Merrill, Associate Professor of Biology. And John Turner, Associate Professor of History. So let me ask you, as we, just to go back to this theme about the impact of your work and this idea of addressing important questions that you raised. Let me ask you a little bit to think about that and talk about whether or not that actually is something that is with you from the beginning as you're thinking about your research. Is it something that comes up through the process of your research? Do you set out at the beginning to really think about how can I have an impact on the world? I don't want to get too sappy about this, but one of the things I really heard in all of your presentations was that your work is done in some meaningful way to actually better the world. And that was a really powerful theme that came out. And again, I think when people think about liberal arts colleges, they think about education and the fact that we better the world through our students who get this incredible education, and then they go on and do great things. But it's actually much more than that. In fact, it's a much more complicated equation. So I would just throw that open to all of you to think about, talking a little bit about the impact of your work and how you think about that piece.
I could start. I think the period of roughly 18 to 22 years is an amazing period that's transformative for all of our students as they emerge from the shadows of their parents and move on into the world of the adults. And I think it's true across the liberal arts and all the disciplines that we have amazing students who want to do something in the world. Speaking more narrowly for my field in environmental studies, we have a strong sense of the applied nature of knowledge. So trying to understand how the world works, the challenges that faces, and finding solutions. And it's not always been the case that that's been valued. I think there's a deep history of scholarship that's applied, not necessarily being appreciated in the way that scholarship that is maybe more theoretical or data-driven. And that's changing fundamentally, I think, across the liberal arts. It's certainly changed in interdisciplinary fields like environmental studies. So I think there's an opportunity today where we can merge the passion that many of us have for our subjects, the passion that young people have for their subjects, but also to engage in the kind of interdisciplinary and applied scholarship that leads to these policy changes you're talking about.
For myself, to address the question in a slightly different way, I defended my dissertation 10 days after September 11th. And I was living outside of Philadelphia and had to drive back to Ann Arbor because there were no planes flying. And in that moment of driving, I thought the whole drive about what the impact of what I study could have on what was surely coming next, because within a month we were at war in Afghanistan. Actually, the day after I got married. It was
Don't do
the-
anything else.
it was
Those aren't
the full-
related, right?
Yeah. No connection. But it was the moment in which I realized that what I studied had implications for how policies were going to be decided, decisions that were going to be made, and that people actually die as a result of the policy decisions that are made in Washington. And it was a very strong moment of clarity that what I do has an impact on how people think about what they see and how they interpret the events that they see. And it was in that moment that I realized my research has to be deeply connected to how I teach and what I teach, because what I hope and want is that the students who come out of my classroom have thought more deeply about what they see on the news, and they interpret it in a more nuanced way. And in the process of doing that, I also learn a great deal from them, and they push me to ask and think about different things that would have not occurred to me because I'm too close to the material.
I think the question of impact in my field is interesting, because I really do spend a lot of time trying to have an impact in a small field of Hegel scholars. And I write articles and books that I don't expect people outside of that very small field to read. And I do not feel apologetic about that. I love that. That's part of the great joy of having an academic career, I think. And I love passing that part on to students as well, that I teach classes that have no obvious immediate application in the world. But my students show up sort of desperate to know about Hegel, which I think is wonderful. And I want to foster that sense that there's just a joy in ideas and in thinking about a tradition that you might not know anything about. And also just in understanding yourself as part of an intellectual community that extends beyond the time period that you live in and the space that you're in, I think is incredibly exciting and important for the development of minds into adulthood. So I obviously, and I talk more about this in my remarks, I love finding ways that my philosophical interests transfer into doing things outside of the classroom. But I also really love having an impact in my own field and in modeling for students the kind of intellectual excitement that I get just about thinking about really obscure, really hard problems in German. I love it.
I'm actually thinking of some of those right now. One of the things I loved that you said was that you talked about using the museum as a laboratory, and you talked about the course that you created around that. I also thought there was a lot of the way that you all thought about creating your courses around your research also was something I think if you can touch on, because that was so powerful. But I think I'll have to make a pitch. So if there's any of you who haven't been through this museum yet, you don't have to leave now, but soon after, you have to go through this extraordinary museum. It is the best college art museum in the country, and you will know that right off the bat when you walk through it. It's really unbelievable. So I think taking advantage of a resource like this and using it for a course in such a creative way that you did is also kind of a hallmark of the Colby education.
I'll follow Lydia's comments, and they sort of mirror Lydia's comments in that the things that we're doing in the lab on a day-to-day basis, I'm aware that they have biomedical relevance, and I'm aware that it's biomedical funding that funds our research. My students are very much aware too, because they are all biomedically oriented as well. But on a day-to-day basis, when we're in the lab trying to get cells to grow and watching them grow and photographing them and trying to figure out ways of quantifying it, that's such an intimate, small-scale process that brings us so much pleasure to to work out these problems and to problem solve. And while we're doing that, we aren't thinking about, is this a potential treatment for Parkinson's and other sorts of things. It's always there in the periphery. But the ability to focus in on some problem that needs to be very carefully worked out, that may seem like a smaller problem in the bigger world, but there's a real creativity to it in the lab that I just really love.
I'll follow that. It's really difficult when you do anthropology to not get involved in some way that you might imagine as trying to be a good person or trying to do good. Anthropology, cultural anthropology is fundamentally about inserting yourself in other people's lives and understanding their problems and their joys and participating alongside them in their struggles. And so a lot of what we do in anthropology at Colby is helping students understand who they are in those contexts. What does it actually mean to want to do good in the world? How do you define good? What are the moral questions involved in engaging with other human beings around issues that matter to them that may or may not matter to you? How do you comport yourself in those contexts? So we talk a lot about the moral dimensions of human action and human relationships, but we also, like Andrea just said, spend a lot of time playing in the world of ideas. Anthropology has a very applied side. Most anthropologists are applied practitioners who work with policy. But anthropology is also very abstract and very theoretical about what it means to be human. And so we do spend a lot of time just in our little classroom on the third floor of Diamond, sometimes with the curtains closed, just talking about this in a really deep and simultaneously abstract way. And I completely agree that that's fundamental to our project here as well.
So I'm trained as an oceanographer. So they sort of forced us all together right from the day we got to graduate school, because to understand the ocean, you had to understand the coupled systems. That was actually unique 30 years ago. The traditional model is the chemist did chemistry and the biologist did biology, and that was the model, and that's how you got your funding. And I think one of the things that's exciting is that the National Science Foundation has recognized the power of integrated studies to solve problems like climate change. And so there is actually an external force that's pushing scientists to work together collaboratively because they're creating programs that insist on that collaborative interaction. And what's exciting about the work happening at Colby is we're producing students that are very well trained to compete in that marketplace. And so they come to graduate school already having seen those collaborative interactions. And they can pick the programs that have those attributes that make them competitive. And I think that will set them up for future careers in competing for those funds, which are now focused on those sort of collaborative, multi-interdisciplinary projects. So that's a strategic advantage that I think we can bring to our students.
I think there's a sense out in the larger world that undergraduates doing research it's a nice thing, but can they really do much? What do they know at this point? And one of the things that was so interesting was to hear about how all of you engage students in your research and how that actually helps you think differently about your research and your teaching. And we were hearing that from the students who were here during January, never sleeping. So we thought that was one way of engaging them. That was circadian rhythm research, if you didn't hear that. So we've got students who are up all night doing their, but that was extraordinary. But students working on these geographic systems to really understand how tiger habitats are changing over time, something very different, again, from all of that. The students that you had working on ethnographic research, these are, everybody having a very different experience. And I wonder if you can talk, some of you were even talking about having the 3 presidential scholars come in, first-year students engaging in research while they're here. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about what is that like? How productive can students be as researchers? How much time does it take for all of you in thinking about that and helping to train students to be able to be productive, to learn the tools of research?
I'll start with that. It takes a lot of time to train students, I'll say that. And often it's a zero-sum game. You're spending as much time working with students as you might spend if you're working with several students, as you might spend doing something on your own that you already know how to do and can do pretty quickly. So if your point is to get it done and get it done quickly, then that may not be the best approach. On the other hand, there's a lot of peer mentoring that goes on with students. So those of us, especially in research labs where we've got students of many generations, and so it's very easy in that case, depending on the project, but in my case, it's very easy to bring in newer students to the lab who will work with older students. The mentoring is fantastic because I think my students learn more in the mentoring process than they do learning from me. And then the other side of it for me practically is that I'm a complete klutz in the lab, and my students know that, and they keep things very far away from me. I can tell students how to do just about anything in the lab that's related to my research with extensive detail, but you don't want my thumbs on any of it. And so they're fantastic at that. And so it's, for me, it works really well to have students. And I didn't mean that to be entirely funny. Students are very productive. Students are very productive in my lab, and I couldn't do it without them. So.
I get seasick.
An oceanographer, there you go, oceanographer getting seasick.
So if I could send students to sea, it's a good thing. It's a bit practical, maybe that you were looking for a little higher order discussion.
Yeah, no, that's
But I'll have to echo Andrea's comments. I mean, the key is to have a layered approach, and so that they can be learning from each other. And I think if you sort of had a senior-only model, it's pretty hard.
yeah.
I always tell my colleagues the only problem with Colby students is they graduate with annoying regularity. So that by the time they're trained up and ready to go, they're off to someone else's lab. And so, I mean, that's you know, it does take time. And I think in a large part, that's part of the reason we're here. But we need to be aware of that and then work through it and then have that tiered approach. And we can also rely on some of our collaborators. I mean, the best sort of trajectory for a chemistry student is to get in the lab early, get credentials by working in our labs in their sophomore summer so that they can go to somebody else's lab in their junior summer and then head to grad school. It's an interesting dynamic, but in fact, that's the sort of perfect resume, and that's what tells them whether they actually like it. I mean, the other component of research, we always think of research as a path toward a scientific career. Sometimes it's a path toward something completely else, and we shouldn't downplay the importance of experience at telling us what we like and what we're good at and also what we really don't like.
Well, you pointed that out with the student you were talking about who had done so much scientific research, but now is doing policy. And you have to think that the work that she did actually in the labs on the research vessels are going to help her as she thinks about the policy side of things.
Absolutely. She'll be much better because she understands where all the data that she's using in the policy, in formulating policy, comes from. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's a really powerful insight that you don't have if you haven't been there.
Mm-hmm. I agree with all the comments, and I'll maybe just add that in addition to the work we do with the students, it's very much a two-way street. And every year I'm learning from the students because of what they're learning in different disciplines. Over 70% of Colby students, over 80% of environmental studies students travel abroad, for example, and they're coming back with lots of different ideas and experiences. I have students coming in with experience, for example, from our colleagues in computer science who can do things that I can't do. So there's a lot that I'm learning each year from these students who do leave with annoying regularity. And then there's a lot, even if it's not senior to freshman, there's a lot of co-learning within these cohorts. And these students that collaborate together, whether it's through summer research programs or in research courses, where I think there's a tremendous amount of learning that's going on that's tremendously valuable that they carry on, whether it's going to top graduate schools or leadership in other fields.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to be the wet blanket here, but I really can't use students in my research for my scholarship. And I think that's important to understand that that's part of the Colby faculty experience also, that some of us, for linguistic reasons or other reasons, it would take me a decade to bring a student up to speed on what I work on, and there wouldn't be very many students interested. But that's why, I don't know why, that's why I've felt so excited about integrating the idea of research into my classes, even if it can't be a part of my own scholarly trajectory. And it does become a cost-benefit consideration for someone in my case, for sure. But being able to engage students in research in classes means that I can explore things with them that I wouldn't have time or expertise to do myself. And I also think just modeling the sense that I, despite being a professor, don't know everything and need their help in bringing information from the community if we're talking about global justice issues in a local context, or in the context of the museum. I remember when I was doing this course as a lab last year, and we had an exhibit, and each student was assigned one artwork. Some of them, the student would come back to me and say, "Professor Mullen, there's nothing on the internet about that artwork." And I would say, "Great." And that this is good news, not bad news, that they now really can contribute to a body of knowledge. And I mean, I think that the other thing that is really important for me to say is that there are some classes in which a research model with students is really appropriate, and some classes where it is not. Some classes in which you really need to be someone who has trained very hard over multiple decades to deliver certain content. And then there are other classes in which that sort of exploration is appropriate and good. And so this course on art was more the latter. And the sense that students could come to that class contributing to a body of knowledge rather than only receiving it worked really well in that class for me. It wouldn't work well as a model across all of my classes.
I'd like to echo a couple of the linguistic difficulties for people who work with text in languages that used to be considered obscure but now less so. And also a plea for the esoteric, the people who think that what you do is not necessarily relevant actually is, in a way of expanding the human awareness of how these young adults are going to interact with their world and how they're going to see themselves in relationship to other human beings and how they're going to negotiate those relationships. And I think that that's a very important outcome of the liberal arts education and the distribution requirements, and that you have to take history and you have to take social science and you have to have language and you have to be able to do sciences and you have to have literacy in each of these fields so that you can become a more complete human being. And just as a short anecdote, because I like telling stories, in 1995 I was at a party with graduate students, because I was a graduate student, and I ran into a colleague who was doing something very, very different and something very applied, and he said, "So what do you do?" And I said, "Well, I work on 9th century Caliphate Islamic law, and I'm interested in how and why these power structures are developed and why people are excluded and included and how that all works." And he looked at me and said, "Why on earth would you care about that?" And I said, "Well, but there's this guy named Bin Laden." And he said, "So?" And I keep reflecting on that, thinking about, here's this person who is highly educated, a graduate student, who said, the esoteric, the thing that you can't immediately prove to me as being relevant is not worth looking at. And I thought, how sad is that? Do you miss that whole liberal arts, that it's important to know art. It's important to understand that. It's important to read literature. It's important to understand chemistry. It's important to know where tigers are and why they're not and why they're not there. It's important to understand biology. It's important to be able to do ethnographic research and understand who is where and why. And it's important to understand the deep philosophical questions, why are we here? So I just have to add my plea for the esoteric. As someone who went from being extremely esoteric to now considered extremely relevant. And I'm waiting for the day when I go back to being esoteric.
Yeah. Well, I'll respond by saying, piggybacking on both of those, in anthropology, we are somewhat reluctant to encourage students to do ethnographic research. They have to jump through a lot of hoops, a lot of prior training before we allow them to do it. They have to engage with the institutional review board if they're going to be working with human subjects. They have to take a full semester methods course. Ethnographic research is hard, it can be dangerous, and it's really not for everybody, not even for all anthropology majors. And so the ones who want to do ethnographic research tend to be a self-selected bunch, even within our cohort of majors, which is fine. And so a lot of what we do is the, as I said before, playing in the world of ideas, the more esoteric. For the times that I have engaged students in my own research, I did it twice in South Africa when I was living there with Colby students, and that felt like a terrifying 24/7 job. It was just every minute of every day I was, just dashing around, checking up on my students and what they were doing and where they were. When I did it here, with the goal of our semester-long projects being the museum exhibition one semester, the website another semester, again, that was 24/7, constant supervision and work. The students found it incredibly challenging, and they felt that it really mattered because they were working in collaboration with a community that had very clear ideas about what they wanted. And the students kept saying to me, it's not like it's just for you. Like, this is for people, that what they were trying to do. It really, really mattered to them. It was scary and frightening, but also really quite enlivening. But that's an impossibility semester after semester with the kind of research that we do in anthropology. You rev up, you run like hell for a semester, and you hope there are no crashes, and then at the end you all, are really thrilled with what you've done, but you're not ready to do it again for a while.
Well, let me ask if there must be some questions from the audience as well.
Thank you all. That was just so just invigorating and just wonderful. And Catherine, I was really struck by your description of the spectacular failure your student experienced. And I wonder if all of you can reflect a little bit more about the place of risk-taking and failure in the classroom and in your research. You can't take risks without ultimately failing at times. And how do we reward, or what role and what place do risk-taking and failure have for you as teachers and scholars?
Anybody want to talk about your failures? I'll just say very quickly that I would echo what Catherine said, that when students take on these kinds of projects, especially if they're going out into the community and interacting with marginalized communities, failure can be really bad for them, but also for the people that they're working with. And the way I've dealt with the couple of cases like that I've had, and as you say, you often see them coming, it's very hard, is just to have a very clear reflective piece at the end where they really need to talk about why this went wrong and where. And that can be, I guess, a learning lesson also. In my own research, I take risk with ideas. And sometimes you give conference papers and they don't go over well at all, and then you start over again. But I'm not engaged in the kind of full-scale, out-in-the-world sorts of risk-taking that some of the rest of you are.
I also think, Sharon, it's a matter of figuring out how we're defining failure. Is it a failure to have spent an entire semester working really, really, really hard for something that you believe in, that you don't ultimately succeed in getting past, but doesn't mean that you won't? And so, thinking of, having these big life questions about what happens when you don't get what you want. That's okay. It's going to happen a lot. And what you really learn is, then what do you do about that? How do you assess that? How do you reflect on it? How do you deflect and move around?
And I would add that as human beings, we learn infinitely more from failure than we do from success, because success, you might often not know why you succeeded, and you don't reflect on it because you succeeded. If you fail and you're given a chance to reflect on it, you can dissect it and do a postmortem and figure out what went wrong, and you learn a huge amount in that moment at which you start to take it apart and figure out where the flaw was.
I would echo John's comments as well, in that you learn so much more by failure, by things going wrong in the laboratory, in my case. And I try to encourage my students, I tell them, sure, these reagents are expensive, it's difficult to get the animals, but that isn't really the point. There's always another way to do things. But you will learn more when something doesn't go well, when you're trying to culture those cells and get them to grow and live for a couple of days, and you can't figure out what's going wrong because they keep dying. And going back to it over and over again until it works is far more satisfying than having it work right the first time. So I almost want them to fail. And in fact, I tell them right off the bat, you're going to start growing some brain cells, but what I want you to do is maybe sneeze into the brain cell culture or do something, because I want you to see what it looks like when you grow those bacteria in there that aren't supposed to be there, because you're going to want to know that. And so failure, I think, it's a safe environment in which to fail. For one thing, the stakes are not as high for students to fail in this environment and then take that knowledge about how to fail and then how to pick yourself back up and succeed, take that on to the next level.
I think it's an absolutely terrific question, and there's so many different layers of failure that we deal with. I think we often don't think about it as failure. In my field in environmental studies, we often talk about the doom and gloom, that for every thing we're trying to work on, it seems like something else is popping up that's even worse. And it's important to sort of reflect on our successes, but also that we can't make changes often in things in a day, a week, a year, or maybe even in a lifetime. We have many small examples of failure. I had one student a few years ago who worked for several nights, could have used some melatonin, on a GIS project, and he was just before the final presentation, and the computer crashed, and he lost all his data, and he lay down on the floor, curled up in the fetal position, and his roommate took his picture, and you'd think that he would never touch this thing again. And he got back up, and he redid everything, and he presented it, and he's now spent the last half a decade working on GIS and maps, and talk about persistence and failure. So I think there's the individual examples of this. I think there's examples that happen over the course of a liberal arts education where students reflect on beliefs they thought they had and realize that those are changing and what they thought they knew didn't. And then more broadly, what's happening in society. So I agree with the comments earlier. I think it's tremendously valuable and an integral part of what we do.
So in the chemistry lab, we call that troubleshooting. Right? And that's in many ways, so we always assume that you're going to walk up to something and it's going to work. And inevitably somebody did something bad the hour before you got there. They turned off the gas, or they turned off the power, or they messed up the reagents. And it's a very different form of failure than we've been discussing previously. But the ability to walk up to a problem, to a physical piece of apparatus, and look at it, and then make a mental list of the things that you're going to do to get it to work is a really powerful toolkit for an experimentalist. And so, when I heard your question, I was like, ooh, failure, what does that really mean? Well, to a chemist, it means troubleshooting and being able to solve a complex problem. It's kind of the click and clack, right, of understanding what's happening with your car.
Other questions?
At some other liberal arts colleges, there's a required piece of senior work, of senior research for all students, either a thesis or a laboratory project or something of that nature. I'm curious what my colleagues think about the Colby position on that, which is that theses are optional, that there's no required piece of intellectual work at the senior level that's across the curriculum.
I could take that on, and I'm going to weasel out of that just a little bit and not talk about a Colby-wide commitment, but in the environmental studies program, we feel like that kind of intellectual engagement is really, really important, but it's an issue of number of students and number of faculty and time to advise. And the way that we've addressed that is every one of our seniors has to engage in a senior research course. So all of our environmental science majors and our environmental policy majors are involved in a real-world research experience where there's a lot of peer learning going on as well as working. So for example, this fall I have 17 students working on something called the state of Maine's environment. And we've been doing this for a decade, and for a number of different topics, if you type it into Google, some of the top topics for Maine show up from those student projects. And so there's a lot of value in terms of the students not only doing the research, understanding the challenges of research, and then communicating and presenting that research in a way that's used. So I think there are ways that we can address that value without necessarily having each individual student do a research thesis, which is difficult.
We have a similar model. It's got a little bit of a hybrid model. We expect all of our seniors to get up twice during their senior year and talk about a research project that they were involved with. And that could be a research project that they were involved with at Colby, or it can be a project that they did in a summer lab anywhere in the world, or a jam plan, but it has to be sort of something new, right? It has to be a project that is not reproducing somebody else's work, but actually trying to discover something new. And the important piece of this is not only doing the work, but speaking about it in a public venue. So that's sort of how we deal with some of the numbers issues, is that not all of our students are doing it with the faculty at Colby. Maybe 80% of them are, I think this is in chemistry, but 20% of them are doing it at research labs all over the country.
I think it's a little discipline specific in a way that makes it difficult, for me anyway, to envision a college-wide project like that. In philosophy, for instance, one of the factors is that most students don't arrive at college having done philosophy already. I didn't know what philosophy was when I started college, and that does mean that there's a little bit more of a lag time before a student is really ready to do independent research. Some of our students absolutely are, and those are the ones who do honors theses, but for those who aren't, I think we felt like we're better served by having sort of like what you've said, other kinds of venues for them to show their accumulated knowledge and their participation in what it is to be a professional philosopher at that level. So we have a colloquium series in which they interact with speakers that we bring in, do some research on the paper that the person is presenting, and then in a panel discussion ask the speaker about that paper. So that's one of the ways that we've tried to have a kind of senior experience for our students without requiring all of them to write a thesis.
We also have the senior capstone seminar in anthropology where students do a semester-long major research project, but we don't require a thesis from all of our students, nor would I be in favor of doing it, for a variety of reasons, one of which is the sheer numbers of it. We couldn't possibly do that as faculty.
The questions? There was a hand back there before.
Thanks, guys. A bunch of my friends are up there, and you guys did a great job.
I like
Yeah, I listened to every one of your talks, and I really enjoyed them. I was a little disappointed by Phillips because he didn't begin by reciting "Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright in the Forest of the Night." And I'm in the English department, and we didn't have a poem. So, Philip, other than that, it was brilliant. But I just wanted to make an observation, since I did listen to everybody's talks, about a common theme that I noted that I found very heartening also. President Greene mentioned policy as a common theme, and this one is related, but I would say listening is a theme that everybody brought up. And I mean, Catherine talking about listening to the stories and helping students learn how to listen well, which is, listening skills are just really vital obviously in history, whenever you're dealing with any other culture. And so for Lydia also, the way you talked about helping your students learn to listen to this other culture. And then even in the lab, I feel like in the sciences you're also doing, you were talking about a kind of attention, a kind of listening to the environment, to the natural world that requires a similar kind of putting aside of the self as does listening to another person. So I just found that to be like a really a lovely theme, and it makes me also want to have people here think about how libraries and books are places that encourage people to listen by the very fact, the very evidence of many voices, many perspectives, and a whole history of knowledge surrounding one in an organized way. I feel like it would be very consistent with these superb professors and with our college to also have a library that encourages putting aside the self and listening to many voices. But I would like them to maybe say a little bit more about listening, if that's possible, if there's time. Thanks.
Well, I'll start. I mean, you can't do anthropology if you don't listen. That is exactly what anthropology is about. It's about deep listening. A famous anthropologist called our methodology deep hanging out, which is what we spend a lot of our time doing. But a lot of that is listening. I mean, it's essential. And one of the things that we talk a lot about in class when we go through the requirements of a class and you get a certain percentage of your final grade is based on class participation, ensuring that students understand participation means listening, not just talking. And talking about how to actively listen is something that we talk about and listen to each other talking about as well. So I thank you for bringing up that point. That's lovely.
I would say in the laboratory that translates to observing, perhaps, more than active listening, and just being mindful of what's going on and tuning out the rest of the world and just tuning into the process of what you're doing and really thinking about that process. So yeah, I would agree that it's important.
Elizabeth, I thought that was a wonderful comment. Thank you for bringing that up, and I
Now
do
recite
deeply
the poem.
apologize. That was really, really too bad about the poem. Note to self.
You still have time.
After a cup of coffee. I think in environmental studies, it is absolutely imperative in a lot of fields, because often what seems simple at first is actually very complicated and very difficult after you listen. And I think that's so true out in the real world. If you think about just about any environmental problem, whether we should have natural gas that reduces its carbon footprint of oil but has the consequence of fracking, whether we should think about something like tigers through the lens of population biology or through the lens of cultural anthropology, we might come to very different conclusions about those same problems. So I think listening to different perspectives and being open to those perspectives is part of the liberal arts experience that's so important.
I think maybe one other way of thinking about it is that we all hear that our students increasingly come to us exhausted in many ways because they've been so driven to be overachieving in their high school experiences, and that's part of what makes them successful students. But I think part of what we can also teach them is that sitting and listening is another really important way of being in the world, that just doing and doing and doing is not productive. But then also to build on what you were saying, that listening is not a passive activity. It's also, it's an activity. And it's something that you can learn to do in a better way that can maybe allow for more stillness in your own comportment in the world.
I ask you about this piece that you just, one of the things that we hear on a lot of campuses is how students have become so credential focused, beginning long before they ever go to college. And they're really checking boxes to get there, and they end up coming to college and then continue that. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, if you're seeing that at Colby, and if you've seen changes over time in terms of the way that students come in, approach their education, from the good and the bad. How are you seeing changes in those areas?
For me, I think it goes back to Sharon's question about failure. Failure is not an option. And so helping students understand what failure means and how to handle it is really important. The other change that I've seen, I've been here 20 years, and the change that I've seen is a much greater interest on the part of students to know what I want them to do. And so that has been shifting. It's shifted particularly dramatically, I would say, over the past 2 to 3 years. They want to do what I want them to do. They want to know what are the rules, what do they need to do to meet those rules, what's the game plan for how they're supposed to perform, and then they will do it. And so when they have a little bit less structure, more creativity, at least in my classes I found a lot of fear, a lot more uncertainty about how do you take intellectual risks and face the possibility of failure. That's just not something that I think has been allowed to them in high school. So speaking quite bluntly, this is really a fear of mine. It's something I feel very seriously concerned about.
I think there are definite ways in which students internally and through external pressures feel pressure for that credential. I had 2 conversations, one this morning and one yesterday with 2 different students. A student this morning decided to drop a minor, but felt conflicted because he thought that it would look good on his resume when he graduated. And this other student, I've had other conversations like this as well, they feel pressured when they arrive to pursue certain majors because of the expectation that that might get them further after they leave Colby. And yet they fall passionately in love with something through an intellectual engagement with faculty or other experiences. And there's that conflict. Do I pursue that passion, or do I pursue what other people think I should be pursuing in that checklist? And I think that's one interesting challenge as we build up these expectations and these credentials, and then more majors and then more minors that our students are going to face.
Thank you all. This has really been great and makes me proud to be part of our faculty. One of the things that I don't think came up, but I'd like to hear you talking about, is intellectual differences in taking a risk, and whether the extent to which we encourage students who disagree with the majority of students on critical points to express those, and whether they are comfortable expressing those views, and whether other students are listening to those views as well.
I'll go directly to that because I often talk about controversial things. I begin each semester and regularly remind them at several points that they are supposed to disagree. They're supposed to take the information in that we are working through in the readings and in the class, and they are supposed to come to their own conclusions. And if they agree with me, something has gone wrong. That they are supposed to take the information and come to a different place and arrive at their own decisions. And so I actively talk about this because for many of them, what Catherine was talking about, this is the case, that they're afraid of failure. They're afraid of somehow not doing well on the standardized tests that they had in high school, and that's carried over for them into their, as they come to college. And you have to explicitly tell them, disagree. Disagree with me. I say something, that does not mean it is gospel. And that's an absolute rule.
I know we had a couple questions over here, too.
I'd just like to say I'm glad that Sandy's here with a bow tie, so I'm not the only one. But I just finished the book Excellent Sheep, which is a recent publication by a Yale professor on the topic of over-credentialing and the students being afraid to take classes outside their major. And I have to tell you, if anyone knew me back at Colby here, I had no fear of failure. I failed a lot. I failed so much that Janice Seitzinger is the only reason I'm still a graduate. But I'd like to hope that the students that are coming to Colby are not so over-credentialed and not so concerned, as some people seem to indicate, that they can't take these intellectual risks outside their major or outside their wheelhouse because they're afraid 4 years from now they're not going to get a job. And I know the financial crisis of 2008 certainly put a lot of people into the idea of schools are efficient if you get a job. I mean, schools are efficient. They teach you how to think. Right. And if you can't think, you'll never get a job. So I'm just hoping that you folks are finding students that are still, looking for under the rocks and trying to find things that are different and are engaging you, whether it's Hegelian philosophy or chemistry or environmental studies, because it would be a shame to turn this into a factory of people who can go get jobs like Texas A&M. And that's where I live. I live in Houston, and I'm in the oil business. And I'll tell you, I mean, there's a lot of people that want their kids to be petroleum engineers, and we need them. But we need philosophers and anthropologists and historians, too. So I guess that's not really a question. I just hope it stimulates some thought.
Well, I'll go directly to it since I spoke about challenging my students to challenge me. Oh, they take me seriously on that. Oh, yeah. And it's good, and it's healthy. And I find that once you open the door and make it okay, then they will run with it. They're brilliant, they're wonderful, they're magnificent to work with, they're a stunning group of human beings. And if you are challenging them, if you are asking of them to ask more of themselves, they will rise to that challenge, and they do.
I think I'll be inelegant in asking this question.
Let me get a microphone.
But, I said, well,
Yes, sure.
I'm certain I shall be inelegant in asking this or presenting this, but you made me think about this. After having experienced years and years of undergraduate and graduate work and 2-3 advanced degrees, I finally one summer took a what is it called? A case study. There's typically used in business schools, and it was the most jolting experience I'd ever had in my life. And after I think 40 years later, I could probably still recall every one of those case studies and how I was mentally trapped going down certain avenues and bang, realized that I don't know how I got here. Have any of you ever thought about using those, or would they have any applicability, do you think, in your courses or your fields? Or have you ever experienced a case study?
Yeah, definitely. That's, I mean, you might be talking about something more specific than what I do in my classes, but for sure, philosophy is full of case studies where we think about how a particular theory plays out in a particular case, or where there are thought experiments or other kinds of narratives or argumentative imagined scenarios in which students are asked to think about how. I guess what I would say to that is, in cases like that, I ask students to think about how a beginning point commits them to decisions many steps forward, and that I was reminded of that by something you said. And I think that is a really valuable experience for students to think about how even unexamined presuppositions that we have about the way the world works, if we play them forward in very specific case studies, we can see that we're committed to things that we didn't want to be committed to. So I certainly do that kind of thing a lot.
I've done case studies in anthropology around issues that go back to where we started, projects that are perhaps intended to make the world a better place. We're going to bring a water treatment facility to a village in some part of the world, and we'll role play. So we'll read about the scenario, and the class will divide up, and some will be WHO representatives, government representatives, villagers, et cetera. And they'll argue through how this is going to happen. And one of the things, to get back to Sandy's question and tie it to your question, is I found students really reluctant to argue in the classroom. It's difficult for them to contradict each other. It's difficult for them to talk back to each other. If they have a difference of opinion, it's difficult for them to find ways to express that they feel sort of, secure. And they do a lot of, I entirely agree with what you're saying. I think you're really right. I'm probably wrong, but could we just think here? And so a lot of what I try to do is model good debate. And so I found these case studies to be a really effective way, because then they're role playing other roles that allows them then to really kind of, have these arguments about what's going to be the better scenario for this imaginary village. So yes, I think that's excellent.
I think we probably have some alums from a different era who weren't quite as deferential at the time.
Yeah.
When I listened to this, my first thought is, can I start again?
Yeah.
But my second thought was, I remember what I was like at age 18. Pretty undisciplined, not very self-confident. Is there a place for the future of liberal arts education to be advocating for gap years, the whole thing about credentialing and how people come, it's dot to dot to dot. Should going forward, liberal arts colleges like this think about encouraging people to take a year or two and bring that distance and experience with them when they then have the chance to go to this smorgasbord?
No, I think sort of like with the question of honors theses, with the wide variety of students, I think in some ways that can be empowering and some less. I had one student, Blair Braverman, who, as we were doing the introductions in an intro ES course, she sat down and she talked about how she had used sled dogs on glaciers in Alaska, and how she had lived with Sami reindeer herdsmen in Norway because of a gap year she'd taken before she arrived. And she just captured the room with her stories, and she was so mature and she'd experienced so much, and she was a very special person, and she was able to take advantage of that. For many of our students who travel abroad, I see that maturation as they start exploring other parts of the world and being exposed to ideas and people that they weren't so familiar with. And other students we've had do things like hike the Appalachian Trail to refine their passion for why they wanted to go to school. So I think there's a range of reasons it works really well for some students. I suspect for others that may be the period after they graduate. That's the gap year, that they take some of those experiences from college. So I think it's that those real life experiences, I think the bottom line, are important in the learning process. But whether that's institutionalized, I think that's another question.
You know, one of my concerns about an institutional gap year is that the financial ramifications for some students, they just simply can't afford to necessarily spend a year before heading to college. I mean, so some students have tremendous resources, and that might be an opportunity, and for others it would mean that they're working at a job that may be better to get that research position at the end of their freshman year after they've gotten some credentials, and that will be a more informative experience. And so I think it's an interesting opportunity, but we have to be a little bit careful about the impact that has on the entire demographic of our student body.
I know, speaking personally, if I had taken a gap year, I would have gotten lost. That part of going into the liberal arts college experience was finding more truly who I am and how I should be in the world, and that was tremendously powerful, and I would have completely driven by it had I not gone. If I had taken the year off, I would have missed that almost completely.
Okay. So you all are very successful professors, and my question is about the relationship between what school and not school. And I think this job encourages creep more than almost any other. And Catherine talked about being on 24/7 and then not being able to continue that continuously. And I'm wondering, what is it that you do to keep going? And where do you draw the line? And as an institution, I think we need to understand that it's important to provide faculty with the time to recover and keep going so that we can keep the intensity at the level that the students have really come to expect.
I should point out he's the chair of computer science, so as he's talking about more time for faculty, so this is actually a question I wanted to ask in a somewhat different way, and it came up a little bit in your comments earlier, Whitney, which maybe I took as a plea for reducing the teaching load, but we can. Maybe it was more subtle. Maybe it was more subtle than that. But I think that this question about your time and how you use it, and we'll have to wrap up in a few minutes, so maybe one more question after this, but thinking about that, and I was also thinking about this in terms of the students, the needs of the students as they're coming in. So I know I'm going to regret asking this question later on. I'm already regretting it, in fact. So, but thinking about what would make a difference in your lives as you think about this? So but more money, more time, I know. But it's not just, but and that can be the answer. But it'd be interesting to hear from you in thinking about how you allocate your time, how you think about this, how the demands have shifted over time for you in terms of the kind of work that you do. You know, we can't be successful unless we're the kind of place where faculty can do their very best work and students can do their very best work. That's just the reality of it. And so what does it take to get there? What do you need? What will students need to be able to do their best work here?
A 4-course teaching load. I think would make a difference.
So, okay.
I said they turned off my mic.
Yeah, that was not a mistake. We're actually cutting it back here. Nicely done. That was.
He knows what I said.
I could hear it over here. A reduction in teaching load. Our faculty teach 3 courses one semester, 2 courses another semester, and so that was a 4-course teaching load was the answer. That the number of liberal arts colleges, not a relatively small number, have 4 courses. Some have 5, some have more. We're at the 5 level, but it is a time commitment, right? And so that's one issue in thinking about your time is how many courses you have.
I think another thing that I know, I'm taking this idea essentially from you, but you've said that we are far below our peer institutions just in the number of staff people that we have. And I can imagine several places in which if there were a staff person who could really take care of something that ends up falling in my lap, that would help a lot. The more international students we have, the more need we have for tutoring for those students. So I can help some students learn to write better, even if they're international students, but I just don't have the training to help students who really need a lot of help with English. That would be true of students with learning disabilities as well. It would be also true of what percentage of my time I spend in administrative things. The joy and the difficulty of this job is that it will take everything you give to it, and I love that. But the potential for burnout is enormous. And I also think we need to model for our students healthy behavior on this subject. And so I think limiting the amount of time that we spend on email with them, or even the hours of the day that we spend emailing students, I think all of that is really important, just as far as, modeling for them what it means to stop working at a certain point, since they're all encouraged to overachieve and check off credentials to begin with, but also just as an attempt to be the most healthy community members that we can be.
I thought it was ironic that Bruce made that comment. He's a marathon running, violin playing scholar with his own business. I mean, I don't know how he does it all, so maybe you should be answering that question. But, obviously the time money thing's good, but I saw Lori taking notes on that, so that's set. I think one way is thinking about it as a win-win situation. And I think one of the things that engaging with students and things like research does is actually allow you to buy time. Because part of what you're doing is learning yourself and you're getting scholarship. Part of what you're doing is training and educating with the students. And I think that's one way that we can engage our students in ways that really are year-round. Sometimes it's directly with them. Sometimes they're off working with themselves. But that's one way that as the days get shorter, when the more people you work with and the more collaborations you have, and several of us talked about collaborations at other institutions, and increasingly that's a way to deal with these complex problems and engage students in ways that they're addressing these problems with many other people as well. And so I think we can have some win-win situations where we can do more with the students and get more out of it.
So my colleague Charlie Conover in physics says, I teach for free, they pay me to grade. And there's always aspects of our job that we love, and there's always aspects of our job that's pretty tedious, and it comes part and parcel. I think a major component to understanding the time and money issue is to be a little bit more overt about what the college values and how that plays into what our job function is. And if we can have those conversations, and we won't always agree on what, because we know what we like, but having those conversations about what's valuable and why it's valuable to the institution can kind of help us steer and manage that real-time limitation, and do it in a way that we can sort of feel like we have some ownership then over that issue.
I'll follow along with some of Lydia's comments and others as well, in that modeling for our students what is appropriate for their interactions with us, as well as what we do in our own time and with our own lives. And another thing, Lydia, that you said was staffing and the way that we use our time. And for example, I think I've made this comment to you before, Lori, it's very expensive to pay me to do things like make saline. You know, other people could do it much more cheaply than I could. And so there's a lot of economy of time that I think needs to be investigated. What are we doing with our time? Are there ways that we can be more efficient? Is it better to have a staff person do a certain set of things such that we don't have to think about those things? And the internet, you know, has creeped into our lives in a way that allows us to be constantly accessible. And I know that I'm not the one to be talking because I just moved onto campus as a faculty resident. But I'm hoping that in doing so, I am modeling for my students. This is how to interact with professors, and this is how we use our time.
Anybody want the last question? Not to put the pressure on that question, but there's one back in the middle.
Hi, I seem to be one of the few students here, so I figured I would try to do my part to represent. So this might end up being a selfish question as one of the few students here. But you guys made a lot of really insightful observations about our experience that I really appreciated, and I was wondering what advice you have for us to make the most out of our time here. I'm a senior, so any last minute advice would be great. Thank you.
Well, I'm not worried about you because I've had you in class, and I know I know you are making excellent use of your education. So what I could say about you that I wish all of my other students would hear is just intellectual engagement and willingness to excel, but a flexibility about taking on challenges that may be new to you, and writing really, really well, which is something that comes to mind when I think of you. So. That's a very generic answer, but it's tailored to this particular student as well.
Well, this is a liberal arts college, so obviously what that's supposed to mean is plunging yourself into the full breadth and diversity that the liberal arts has to offer. So what I know that we're probably going to have a discussion down the road about our distributional requirements, but I hope that enables us to talk really broadly about what does it mean to be at a liberal arts college. That should always mean that you skip through the disciplines, that you, I don't mean skip over, I mean skip through, that you sample and you try different things that you never imagined you would ever be sitting in a class in, things that in high school you'd never heard of before. I teach in a discipline that a lot of students have never heard of before, so it's in my best interest to suggest that. But I do think, this is the time in your life that you can go take that classics class. You may never have the chance to do that again. So really taking advantage of the intellectual richness and riches that are available at a campus like this certainly would be my advice.
Take advantage of all the diversity of extracurricular opportunities that are happening on campus. I think, sort of reflecting on my own college experience, you kind of get into your senior year and you're like, wow, why didn't I start doing that? Going to those talks or plays or other things sooner, and bring your friends with you, because then you start having conversations about what you heard and what you saw and why that matters. And so there's a lot of opportunities on campus that I don't think are sampled as broadly as they could be, and creating an environment where we're sampling it. So the room is full every time there's an interesting speaker. Would be a great way for students to take full advantage of the opportunities here.
And I would add two things to that. You should go to the art museum. If you have not been in the art museum by the time you graduate, something is terribly gone off the rails. 2, engage Waterville. We are in a wonderful place. Waterville is a fantastic community. You should find ways to connect to it and with it, and engage the people who live here, not just the faculty on campus, but the inhabitants of this town where you're spending 4 years, because it is a wonderful place, and you should connect to it.
I agree with all these comments, and I would also add that you're at the beginning, not the end. And all of us were students, and I'm still looking for what I want to do with my life and trying to find my way. And hopefully what you're doing now is just beginning to plant the seeds for lifetime learning. So take advantage of what you have here, but also carry that intellectual curiosity and those risks with you the rest of your life.
You know, there's obviously a lot of angst about liberal arts these days. If you pick up any newspaper, you can read all of these stories about, boy, no one will ever get a job, or this, you know, they're all sheep, or whatever. I think he used to be at Yale, by the way, right, which is part of the reason, right? It's a good point to criticize the Ivy League and other places from when you're outside. But I think it's if you listen to today's discussions, I think it's hard to be anything but really optimistic, actually, about the liberal arts. You really feel the deep connection of the liberal arts in their most core, fundamental way being connected to the larger world. That seems to me to just be absolutely true, and we really heard that today. So I walk out of here today, and every time I've been on this campus, I've felt this, that for Colby College, the future really couldn't be much brighter than it is when I hear this. If you sit there today and you think about, are there troubles with the liberal arts? Who wouldn't want this education? Who wouldn't see this as preparation for all different ways into life? This seems to me like the most powerful, potent form of education that you could have. So I want to thank all of you today for talking about your own work, for sharing with us the kind of research that you do, how you think about your teaching, and the relationship of the two. I do think that that's part of what makes Colby so special, because those two things come together in such powerful ways here for our students and for our faculty. So everybody pray for some good weather for tomorrow. And it's just going to be a terrific night tonight. We're going to have some fireworks tonight on a perfectly clear sky. Tomorrow will hopefully be a wonderful day. But more importantly, this is just an amazing time for Colby College. And I think as we saw all of you today and listened to you, it was hard to be anything but absolutely proud of this place. So thank you for giving us so much time.